welcome you to the first of the 2012-2013 Urban Growth Seminar talks. We're running a theme this semester, and this first talk is a little off theme, but fantastic. So let me describe the theme, and then the great material we'll hear about today. Our theme for this fall is planning and health, from research to practice, and we are probably going to continue that theme through the spring semester. So what we will endeavor to do will be to really bring in persons who are at the cutting edge, either of the research field or the practitioner community, and who will really be able to interpret leading edge thought developments in the discussion around planning and health, and link that to what that means for practice. Last point, today's talk is a panel around the question of, is Los Angeles the creative or the anti-creative city? Let me introduce our panelists. Professor Elizabeth Currid-Halkett, an associate professor here in the Price School. Her research is on economic development with a focus on art and cultural industries. Her research explores the role of nightlife, the cultural industries, and informal social environments in generating economic growth for cities. And we wonder why her classes are popular with our students, right? It's because of her exceptional teaching. It is, I'm not joking about that. Most recently, her work has been a study of Getty Images media photographs to study the clustering of cultural entertainment events. I don't see Elizabeth's two books mentioned here by title, so I'll let you tell people about that when we get to you, okay. So be sure to plug the books. Also, Dr. Sarah Schrank, Professor of History at Cal State Long Beach. Professor Schrank is an author of Art in the City, Civic Imagination and Cultural Authority in Los Angeles. She is the co-chair of Public Art Dialogue, a national organization dedicated to conversations about issues of audience, censorship, curatorship, and site specificity that inform public art in the U.S. and around the world. And our moderator for the panel is Professor David Sloan, also of Price School. Dr. Sloan's research examines urban planning and public health, health disparities, and community development. He has authored The Last Great Necessity, Cemeteries in American History, and co-authored Medicine Moves to the Mall. He serves on the board of advisors to the Journal of the American Planning Association and is a director of the Vernacular Architecture Forum. Let me also thank Anne Bray, who has organized the broader set of talks that this is a part of and has brought this opportunity to us. Let me turn this over to David Sloan and remind him that at some point Elizabeth gets to plug her books.
Oh, Elizabeth doesn't have to do that because I'm going to plug her books.
Okay, thank you.
Welcome. Today we have two amazing guests to discuss creativity, community development, and the city. This event is part of a larger set of changes and challenges in urban planning and in art that the series SoCal Social, instigated by the artist Anne Bray, will be discussing over the next few months. I put on the board here, just in case you can't see it at the top, the website, freewaves.org, where you can find this. But this is what that website looks like. Each of these events revolves around the complicated concept of socially engaged art. For many older folks, when we think of such a phrase, we think of the protest posters and ethnic and feminist identity projects of the 1960s and 1970s. And indeed, that is socially engaged art. Another variant of socially engaged art has become much more visible in the last 30 years. Perhaps because of the shift from an industrial to post-industrial society as suggested by the work of Richard Florida, defining the creative city, or a new demand for community involvement in planning processes, as detailed in work on community benefits agreements and new modes of resident engagement, such as design charrettes. This aspect of socially engaged art is the role of art and artists in community change, especially in vulnerable communities confronted by new challenges. Much of the discussion of these issues has related to gentrification, another complicated term, and the role that artists play as pioneers in the gentrification process, such books as Sharon Zukin's work. While we're going to delve into that aspect, we want to start with a broader question announced in the title of the event. Is LA a creative city? Sarah Schrank's new book, or book, I should say, because she's quite productive, Art in the City, which I highly recommend to you, explores the history of Los Angeles' contentious relationship to art, especially innovative contemporary art. While Elizabeth Currid-Halkett's two books, Warhol's Economy and Starstruck, examine the economic geography and social networking surrounding the cultural economy, or at the foundation of the cultural economy. Elizabeth also wrote a chapter in my new edited book, the Planning Los Angeles book, that actually provided the catalyst for this session. In that essay, she discussed the Otis Cultural Economy Report that found, according to Ann Markison, that Los Angeles is America's artist supercity. Not New York, not Chicago, not someplace else, but we are America's artist supercity. It also found and discussed that that city seems to take its amazing array of artists for granted, offering them much less public policy and planning support than other cities. In other words, is Los Angeles the creative city, or is it really an anti-creative city? Now, I'm going to pose that question to our guest in just a second, but I want to say a couple things about, one thing about logistics before we start. I'm going to ask a series of questions. This is an informal conversation. There's going to be no presentations, as you'll get many of those through your lives, and you don't need any more. What we want to do is have a conversation. As we go along, I would like you to think about whether you have a question. And in 15 or 20 minutes, I'm going to turn to you to ask if you begin to have questions. If you don't, I have plenty. But I'm hoping that we'll be able to turn this into a dialogue sooner than later. And I hope that you'll get yourselves involved. So, is Los Angeles the creative city, or is it really an anti-creative city? Let's ask our guests. Sarah, do you want to start?
Sure, since you put it that way, David. Thank you also for inviting me to participate. This is a wonderful topic.
Only because you're new. I teach in this room 4 days a week now.
Oh.
It does not project well.
Okay.
I gotta tell you.
All right.
You gotta talk up a little bit.
Talk up a little louder. Okay. I think the question is whether or not LA is a creative or anti-creative city. Can we look at a number of different ways? Obviously, first of all, it's clearly a creative city. We're the second largest media center, an audience, and market in the country, and we both produce and consume vast amounts of popular culture here, and a broad range of it. Whether we're talking about Hollywood productions, television productions, pornographic productions. I mean, these are all part of a very large global cultural economy, and those are all creative fields. And we also have a tremendous art production that's been going on here since the late 19th and early 20th century. And people have been attracted to California and Southern California to produce here. So I think on that front, I think there's no real, I think it's an easy question to answer. But the issue of whether it's an anti-creative city is also, I can have equally passionate responses to, in that this is a city that, despite all of those features, has a long, fraught history of making sites difficult for artists and not sustaining a public sector that allows certain types of artist expression to be fully expressed. We have one of the longest histories of art censorship in the city. Art has been tied to weird elements of public policy and sort of municipal politics historically since really like the 1930s forward that has actually hindered artful production here. So you actually also have a series of networks that have been produced because of those conflicts, where artists will start in Los Angeles in one of the many art schools that are here, and then leave, go elsewhere, kind of make their name maybe in New York or maybe in Europe, and then try to come back to Los Angeles. And that might sound like something that's really familiar, like something that might have happened in the 1980s. It was happening in like 1910. That's actually something, a kind of cycle of experience. And it's something I talk about a lot in the book, but it's in part related to Los Angeles being historically very self-interested in creating its own civic imagery, like presenting an image of itself as a way of promoting itself as an economic force. And that is very, very different from other major American cities like Chicago and New York City, which are also big art centers, which never did that. You get the branding of New York City, but that's sort of in the sort of neoliberal rise of a new global situation in the 1970s when New York is really suffering and you have to rebrand it. I love New York, this kind of thing. But you don't have to brand New York in 1890. You know, it's the 20 million have come. They're in, and they've been spreading to the East Coast. But Los Angeles has this very conscientious self-promotion from early in its kind of Anglo settlement. And that compulsion was tied to the visual arts very early, and I've suggested throughout much of my career writing about this, that that's one of the reasons, and we have a legacy of that relationship that we've not actually lost. So simultaneously very creative and simultaneously a hindrance in peculiar ways. And those, of course, are also historically specific.
Before we turn to Elizabeth, could you give us one example of a weird public policy around art?
Yeah, sure. I mean, there's plenty to choose. We can have fun right away. There's plenty to choose from. The one, my favorite, which is a very sort of good historical onion to kind of unpeel, is in 1951, the City Council of Los Angeles, minus one dissenting city councilman, who was Edward Roybal, very sensible person, passed an ordinance banning abstract expressionist art from any public facility in the city of Los Angeles. And the effect of that was to disgrace Los Angeles in the eyes of the art world. But the ultimate effect of it, even though it was rescinded 3 months later, was to, and I can talk about how this worked, it actually bankrupted the public art program of the city of LA, which in fact was a crisis-creating situation from which we never recovered. And so that was one of these things, which was highly politicized. It's the peak of the Cold War. You know, people are going after Frank Wilkinson, the promoter of public housing. I mean, the issue of public art and the arts is never removed from these larger issues regarding social justice and public spaces. I mean, that's important to understand as students, that these are stitched together, as much as people sometimes want to separate the art out as some sort of specialized economy, which of course it is, but it's also within the history, the fabric of Los Angeles is actually quite intimately tied to it. So that would be one example.
So as we'll turn to Elizabeth now, and one of the things that her works actually shows is the connection between that cultural economy and other economies in her work, particularly on New York, and the incredible relevance of the cultural economy to the larger economy and success of New York as a city. But first, the creative, anti-creative question.
Well, first, thank you very much for having me today. It's really an honor, and it's great to not be talking about diapers and talking about art again. I've been on maternity leave, so this is so much fun to be here. In response to the question, it is of course creative. You know, ostensibly, if you just look at the data, it is. I mean, as Sarah pointed towards it, it is the second biggest art hub. I would argue in certain sectors it's the biggest. So if you look at the fashion industry, if you look obviously at film, it depends how you dice art, it's actually more concentrated than its East Coast counterpart, New York. But I think Sarah brings up an important point here, which is that historically, it's not had this reputation for being a big art hub, but if you look at the history of Los Angeles, it has an extraordinarily strong cultural background. Light and space, some of you here who do follow LA art would know that the light and space movement was one of the most important movements in America's art world. And many of the artists that emerged out of it, Ed Ruscha, Billy Al Bankston, Larry Bell, that these guys they're in the annals of American art history, and yet LA does itself a disservice because they get kind of forgotten, and I think the Pacific Standard Time did a really good job highlighting them. If any of you got to see the Getty exhibit, it was extraordinary. These were some of the greatest artists in American history, and they came out of LA. Warhol was first really discovered in Los Angeles. It was his work. He was not an unknown, but he really shot up to fame with his work that was shown, I believe it was in the Ferris Gallery. The Ferris Gallery itself was really, really important for a very long time in catapulting artists to fame in Los Angeles. So historically, it has been important. The data shows it's important. I think the real problem for Los Angeles is its internal tension between high art and popular culture. So it's actually an aesthetic argument that causes Los Angeles to be, is it creative, is it not creative? Because I think LA isn't so sure if they want to call its film industry creative, its popular culture, its anime creative, its street art creative, that these are not high art, it's not competing with the MoMA, so is this really a creative city? And I think the leitmotif for this is really the debate swirling around MoCA, which is, has the vision under Jeffrey Deitch been effective? Should our museums be showcasing popular art and street art? I just read the review in the New York Times the other day of Warhol's exhibition at the Met, and Roberto Smith totally panned it. And I haven't seen it yet. I hope I can get to New York before it closes. I think it's a shame because I think that we have this myopic view of art, which is that it's only high art and only people with PhDs in art history can say it's art. And I think Los Angeles really does itself a disservice saying that. So I think that's really been the problem. It's not that this stuff isn't there. It's really that we have our own insecurities as a city.
You want to respond to that?
I do. That was very well said. I agree with you completely. And I just have just a few things just to add on, because that's what we academics do. We just like to add to the story and stir the pot and see what sort of pops out. I think you're absolutely right. This internal tension is very, very clear. I think the MoCA situation is a perfect example of it, and one that's, I think, a really serious problem, actually, because the popular exhibits that it's been panned for actually have been the most popular, most productive experiences for a lot of people who normally wouldn't go to an art museum. So what do we want to do? Just shut the doors to a public that's actually interested? I thought that this came up again in a less explosive version, but subtly within the art press of Los Angeles when LACMA had its largest exhibit ever in 2000, which was the Made in California show, which some of you may have seen and gone to, and it was huge. Every building was turned over to the sesquicentennial, the 150th anniversary of California. And I was a graduate student at the time. I got to work on that show, and it was very, very exciting for me. And it was fantastic, and it had high art, and it had popular culture, and it was trying to tell a history of California, but also tied to the arts, and people loved it. But within the art press, locally, people were like, ugh, like how can you have, landscape painting and oil painting next to, skateboarders? Like, what are you doing? Or like the little homies, little figures that would come out of bubble gum machines. Like, how can you include that together? And people were really agitated by it, although audiences adored it. So that's, that's 12 years ago. And so this conversation has certainly been in the 21st century. But one of the things I wanted to add historically to this concern that Elizabeth raised is about the high art, low art. It's ironic because for all kinds of reasons, but in the 1930s, the move became afoot by a lot of elites in the city to basically create the LA County Museum of Art. And one of the first places they went to for support during the Great Depression for money was to the film industry and to the great movie moguls. And the reason they did that was because the moguls had money to contribute. But the other reason that they knew that there'd be success in this avenue is that the moguls wanted to have their craft of filmmaking marked as art production. That they were coming, a lot of them were immigrants, the children of immigrants, they wanted to shed that and assimilate. And one of the ways they saw the way to do that was to stop having filmmaking seen as some sort of craft, but have it marked as art and sort of move up. And by having their name on the side of a building would be a way to kind of do that. So that kind of concern and insecurity has actually been woven into this cultural climate that you say so beautifully. And we're with it, we're living with it now. And I think it pops up with the Jeffrey Deitch thing. And so anyway, had that hurdle been overcome 80 years ago, maybe we would be having some of these conversations now.
It's an intriguing thing because you raised two different, actually Sarah in her book raises a different kind of tension. And that is, if you will, between what is popular or what is perceived as popular. And that also actually includes lots of old high art, right? So Michelangelo has somehow been integrated into the popular culture. And it's really about innovation, or if you will, contemporariness that causes this shattering of LA's confidence. It seems like, and it does seem to happen over and over again. Why do you think that's so true of our city? Why is it that we have so much, we are one of the most, I think legitimately, one of the most innovative, forward-thinking cities in the world at some level. right? In some ways. And yet in this way, we seem to be frightened of the innovation, frightened of the contemporary. And it's not just now, but as you show, it's actually literally been time and time again throughout the last 100 years.
Well, I have a thought. That could be. LA is not unique in this.
No.
I mean,
and I'm not arguing that.
Right, and so like in 1913, you have the Armory Show in New York, and like this is the first time Americans really got to see Picasso, for example, and George Braque, and these sort of the idea of taking the plane and breaking it up, and people freaked out. I mean, there was actually, and not in good ways. People were really upset by it. And in fact, interestingly, this kind of wealthy couple, the Walter and Louise Ahrensberg, started collecting modern art immediately upon seeing that show. They thought it was so cool. And then they moved to Los Angeles and took their modern art collection with them. And so LA was just so provincial that the only place you could see modern art was like in their living room. And then they grew and grew and grew their collection until it was sort of overcame them. And they wanted just to give it to Los Angeles in 1955. Like, here's probably the most valuable privately held modern art collection in the world. Have it. And LA didn't take it. It's at the Philadelphia Art Museum. We lost it. And so we have these kind of moments like that where just people don't know what to do. And so
that's what I meant. Not to interrupt, but
yeah.
In some sense, this is something that goes on in every. I mean, Theodore Roosevelt says in response to the Armory Show, "This isn't art." I mean, Cincinnati with Malthor. I mean, there's all this happens all across the country. But what's striking to me is, this is 1913. We're having a debate about modern art, and in 1951 we outlawed in Los Angeles. It's not 1921. It's 1951. There seems to be this constant uneasiness that really, I think, is striking, and it does. I mean, the MoCA thing's a complicated story for lots of different reasons. Anything that has that many billionaires involved has to be complicated. But I mean, for those who didn't see the show about the graffiti art show, it was a spectacular show. It was a really amazing show in many ways. And yet it was something that made many people uneasy that MoCA would do it. I think they're more concerned about the disco show. But
yeah, I mean, that might be a bridge too far.
I disagree. I can't wait for this.
I'm not surprised.
I mean, I think it's interesting. I mean, if we actually think about what happened with MoCA and with graffiti art, one of the problems for art critics and art historians is that graffiti kids didn't go to art school, and their work doesn't have an obvious reference point. And so it's very hard to put a value judgment on it, either monetarily or culturally. And for those of you, and I show this in my class, so get ready. For those of you who've seen Style Wars, you'll see this complicated problem. At the end of it, these kids are graffiti artists in New York. They're bombing the trains, and suddenly the gallerists are noticing them. It's the next big thing. They get hauled into the galleries. I don't know, maybe two of them, Basquiat. Basquiat might have died even by then. So it was Futura and Lee Quinones. I mean, there were like literally a handful of them who actually made it, because the rest of them, it was just like, well, what is this reference? Are you trying to make a comment on Picasso? Are you making a comment on Duchamp? And the answer is no, they weren't, because they were kids from the projects and they just had some sort of creative pulse. And I think that LA has more of that kind of art, and I think that with Art in the Streets, that was the big judgment call from the high priestess at the FT or the Wall Street Journal, that it just didn't have some sort of historical significance. I would vehemently disagree with them, but that's my perspective.
And on the heels of that, I mean, part of the anxiety that is specific to Los Angeles and kind of moves the conversation just out of something like the Armory Show, which was the New York issue, is that again and again, I'll reify this point that Los Angeles is very interested historically and today in its own civic identity. Like, what is it? Like, we are this huge space. What is it? We're 800 square miles now. We're multiple municipalities within metropolitan borders. Our 5-county area has 22 million people living in it. It's kind of a strange form, and it's been replicated. Its novelty has worn off since about 1960. I mean, we're aware of this. But then how do you define a civic identity in a non-walking city? I mean, there actually are some serious issues about like how you move through this space. How do you identify yourself? You're not always on the trains. New York can have renegade graffiti, but can have in-house graffiti that artists are paid to put up, and then you can sort of admire it as you travel through New York. They've done things like that with poems, etc. Los Angeles doesn't get to have that. So you have to have sites that people were going to go to, and then how do you then define what those are supposed to be? And because there's been a disconnect, I think because of the relationship between the private and the public for such a long time, I think that's just always a fraught position. And you know, sometimes the high priest will want to have like the most avant-garde thing, but that won't attract the public. And then when they do have things that attract the public, it's not going to like put it in an art conversation that's art historical with, you know, right. San Francisco or New York comfortably. In some ways, you know, the art world is having to go through its own changes right now as well. And I don't know if I'm in any position to speak to those, but Los Angeles, for all of its might as a site of such massive production and reception. I mean, people, if you travel anywhere in the world, everyone has something to say about LA, even if they've never been here, in ways that they don't for other places. It's really a unique trope. And that's the civic identity that LA has been both brilliant at confectioning and also terrible. So that's, I think, a conflict that it's very difficult to resolve.
Yeah, it always makes me nervous when we start talking about form, right? Because, well, the reason is that LA's form does make it hard to connect. It's also a reason that many people come here, is that you can get lost in LA's form in a way that you can't get lost in other places. And in some sense, you could see LA's form as creating spaces of freedom or spaces of dislocation. And the quick answer is it does both. And in some sense, the Venice guys went to Venice not because they got to go to the beach, but because it was cheap and it was out of the way and nobody was going to bother them, so they could do crazy things and nobody was going to make any trouble for them until they got just visible enough that people started making trouble for them, right? Where they couldn't do that in other spaces. And so it works both ways. It creates this incredible ability to do things and this, as you suggest, this dislocation, this lack of connection. The relationships are difficult to build. It's one of the things is I know lots of people in other cities who have friends that are around them, and then where are my friends or where are your friends? Where are we, right? Sarah came 18 miles or whatever, 11 miles to come to this today. I mean, the spaces are giant. I'd like to turn us though just a little bit and then go to a set of, to be fair, just to let everybody know, I gave them a set of questions before so they could get ready. And the second set of questions that I think come out of this is what is the value of art to Los Angeles or to any city? How does art play a role in urban life? Because in some sense, we can have these debates about MoCA, and it really feels like an inside the team debate. And yet art plays an enormous role in the civic life of cities in very positive and in sometimes not positive ways. So how would you say, Elizabeth? How does art add to urban life?
Well, I mean, I think in a very obvious way, it adds in the Richard Florida view, right? It is a part of the amenities that knowledge workers seek out. People want to be around interesting things. They want to be around galleries. They want the option. And one of the things I always think about in Los Angeles is that you may not go to a museum every week, but you will pay a premium for the possibility that you might want to do it. It's this idea of infinite possibility, and the arts play a huge part in this. And I think that the way in which you can realize the true impact in that respect is to consider other industries, right? So think about law or finance. I mean, people don't just sort of say, you know what, this weekend I'm just going to stroll around and look at closed banks. I mean, they just don't want to do that. And so there is this sort of magic to art, whether you are an aficionado or just a kid really excited to have moved to Los Angeles. But I think that there are practical things, and this is sticky because it's very hard to quantify and to understand, but I think that artists are change agents. I think that they do change neighborhoods in ways that we can't quite put our finger on. And one of the problems, of course, is that there isn't data on artists per se and associated with the zip code, right? So you've got all these confidentiality issues and census. When I was starting my dissertation, I remember writing the Bureau of Labor Statistic, and there was this lovely economist at the other end, and he would just say, nope, can't do it. Nope, can't do it. And I'd rewrite the question many different ways as to how to get the data, and the economists would write back and say, I'm really sorry, we just don't have that kind of data for you. And so the precision in which to measure this is very difficult. But there's no question that the work, particularly of sociologists like Sharon Zukin, have done, Harvey Molich's work, they have looked at this, and my own work, time and time again, what you see are neighborhoods really changing, and who were the first people to walk into them? Well, it was artists. And so they are really important in terms of the gentrifying argument. They're important in terms of amenities. And I think something that is really intangible but important is that artists brand their cities, right? So Los Angeles, and this is getting back to the identity crisis with Los Angeles, but Los Angeles is branded by the stars in these industries. And whether you're talking in a very general term about the celebrities emerging out of Hollywood, or you're talking about the indie musicians like Beck, that Los Angeles gains something. People want to, if you look at it from just a purely economic development perspective, people want to come to Los Angeles because of the art it generates. And that's a big tourist argument, right? This is that unlike other industries, the arts bring people even if it's just for a week. So,
I come at this question from a slightly different angle, and so I mean, you're absolutely right. I mean, it's tied enormously to economic value and economic production, and we get into this the sticky question of gentrification, because once you gentrify, by definition, you start excluding people from the area because they're the ones who can't afford to now live in a gentrifying community. And so, one of my thoughts is, I'm a cultural historian, not a developer, and so in a lot of ways I tend to try and get at this question from a different angle, because the gentrification issue is really of a serious concern historically. One of the things that art will do for a city, it can happen in any city, but it does produce a sense of ownership, and particularly in neighborhoods, that you can lose if you don't have artists present producing, but also artworks. And again, and one of the ironies of LA's long art history is that we actually, despite a kind of complicated sense of the public here, have a long history of producing amazing community art projects and community art centers that have survived many, many decades. And so you have things like Estrada Quartz, so an old housing project that in the 1970s, caught the attention of like Gerald Ford, because it was producing, through a federal program, an amazing set of murals, like 80 of them, that local kids who were really very marginalized were involved in producing. They're very famous. Che Guevara is huge on one of those Estrada Corp murals. There are these amazing ones of leopards that are like 20 feet high. They're crawling through graffiti. And historians and art critics and stuff have gone back to look at those murals now, because they've been tagged, but they've been tagged in ways that actually mark it as being signed almost by their own producers, although now it's their children. But Estrada Quartz is one place where the arts created energy around the idea of the housing project that wasn't just simply like the housing project in the 1970s. You have self-help graphics, which has been a very important art site, which is also now beleaguered because it's trying to hold on to its lease. That's been producing all sorts of interesting political artworks for the last 40 years. The Watts Towers Art Center is one of the longest running continuous public art or community arts centers in the country since 1959. It's been in different buildings, and it's managed to survive. And that's created a tremendous sense of local value for people who are actually from Watts. And one of the things that happened after the Watts riot, there was in '65, there was a lot of attention and money being pumped into the area through planning, through HUD, and the drawings and designs for Watts involved all of these gentrified neighborhoods that would have the Watts Towers, but completely surrounded by white people. Like all of the African Americans and Latinos fell away. And then that gentrification didn't happen, but the art has continued to survive. And things are complicated now. There's another artist who's gotten involved, Edgar Arsenault, in the Watts House project, and that's an interesting kind of set of conversations also about what it means to have an outsider come in and participate in this. But the sense of ownership over the Watts Towers, which is something I've written about at length, has been long-lasting, like from the minute Rodeo started building them. And that is extraordinarily valuable. And in ways that, unlike other types of art production in cities, the Watts Towers haven't been able to be commodified in the same way. It's actually really not been possible. Maybe to its detriment, because one of the problems is that the Watts Towers are always in danger of not falling down, but of just kind of fading away. But they hold on. And that is I don't know what that is. That's a sort of value that's beyond anything that I can almost put a name to, but it is very important. And of course we have Spark, like Judy Baca's Spark in Venice Beach. And so, long story, as my long rambling answer is that in a sense, the production of the murals that are attached to these art centers, the kids who get art lessons there, the Junior Art Center in Barnsdale Park, which Aileen Barnsdale envisioned in 1926 as being a specific art site for poor people, for working class women. That was the whole point. And she tried to give her 26 acres of Olive Hill to the city for free. Buildings designed by Frank Lloyd Wright, and the city went, oh my God, we don't want anything to do with this. You are a communist feminist woman who's not married with an illegitimate child. And that's what happened. And we didn't get the Barnsdale Park sorted out till like 1970. And so, right? And so, but again, the ownership, kids who are now not such kids, who are my age and older, like learn to sketch and draw by going to the Junior Arts Center. So those art sites are very, very valuable, and people will maybe pay premiums to be near them, but they're still not paying premiums to live in Watts, although those, right? But it still has this value. So I think it's important to have conversations that are about the economics writ large of this art production, how it's tied to galleries, gallery rows, neighborhood safety, but also to the sense of like owning your space and your site and protecting the arts that are there. And I think people have really strong connections to that, and they don't have to be from the commercial art world. They don't even have to be artists. They just have to like live near it. So the interest in how to do that without gentrifying is something that I'm very intrigued by.
Well, the examples you give, obviously the Barnsdales, for those who don't know, Barnsdale's sort of up in Hollywoodish. And then you have the Watts Towers is obviously in Watts, and the Estrada Courts is on the east side. And in some sense, 2 out of the 3 really haven't gentrified dramatically. The third is a complicated spot because it's the Hollywood thing. But in some sense, it has provided those places with identity.
Yes.
And it's intriguing how, can we talk a little bit more about identity and art and neighborhood and how we think about it as scholars or as historians?
Well, I can start. I mean, first of all, I think someone.
And it doesn't have to be LA. If you wanted to use New York examples from the books, that's fine too.
I mean, someone who I think has been doing a lot of good work in this is Terry Clark at the University of Chicago. So he studies scenes, and what he looks at is the differences in the kinds of places people want to live. And I think art does do that, because I think this difference between what's going on in Watts, which I would argue one of the things that's interesting is it doesn't have an obvious commodity associated with it, which oddly holds it back, which is kind of tragic, but I guess that's capitalism for you. That there is this sort of like, well, what do we buy, where do we eat, where do we stay around it thing that I think really means that you're going there for the towers, and that's, so that's complicated. Another way I think that art does shape neighborhoods, and I am going to use a New York example, is looking at how they use space and the kinds of space they need for their aesthetics. So one thing I've been really thinking a lot about as a planner is what are the no-does to people in the art world that me as a planner I don't think of, right? And so one of the things that I've really been looking at recently is the shape of art. And what a colleague of mine in Israel, Gilad Ravid, and I have done is we've basically scraped all of the dimensions of art since the 1800s to look at if there's a correlation by year. And what we're finding is there's a 0.8 correlation. So they're really correlated. Art gets, not only can you pinpoint the relationship between the size of the art and the year it came out, but it gets bigger and bigger and bigger, okay? And in fact, I think like in 1960, it's like power laws. It just starts jumping, okay? And for those of you who know art, you know this, right? You think about someone like Richard Serra, these enormous, what would you even call those? This sort of rust spirals. But the sculptures, okay. But that doesn't really do it service because they're like bigger than this room. The thing about art then is that what is actually produced and what artists want to produce then of course shapes, first of all, where they decide to locate and what those places look like. Now, this isn't to say it's not a one-way street. I mean, artists obviously respond to their milieu too, and this is, I think the light and space artists are one of the most exciting examples of this, which is that what they did is they were in the midst of aerospace and the car industry, and all the materials that were coming out of those industry, artists in Los Angeles started using for their own work, and they created something that was really specific to Los Angeles, that was really not going on anywhere else. But those kinds of things really do shape the way a neighborhood looks. So, the thing I can never figure out, and I'm not sure if we'll ever really know, I'm working with an artist in New York right now because he has a huge archive of artists' addresses from like decades and decades. And as you might understand, he makes beautiful work with, he's actually mapped it. He's done all this, these paintings where he's mapped the artist. But I said, oh, can I see your data? And he said, of course you can. And he sends it to me, and I'm like, oh my God, this is gonna take so long to clean. But it is in fact artists' addresses, right? Which is, honestly, I've not been able to stumble across this at all. But one thing that's interesting is, of course, they all showed up in Soho, right? When they made the move from the Upper East Side, or when art galleries moved to below 14th Street, they were chasing the artists. And the artists did live in Soho, right? Now the question is, did the artists go to Soho because they needed to? Well, work that my colleagues here at USC have done would suggest no, the rent was actually a bit higher. And so maybe that's not why they went. So why did they then go to Soho? Well, is it in fact because the aesthetics of art were changing and they needed particular kinds of places, which is why they picked Soho and not pokey tenement buildings in, the Lower East Side or in the East Village? Because those neighborhoods, while they had a somewhat bohemian flavor, really didn't have the kind of cultural capital that Soho eventually got. So I think that the actual aesthetics of art often shapes where they end up showing up, and then the ensuing developmental effects, the coffee shops, the restaurants, the galleries, and so forth.
Quick comment before I ask anybody out there. So I promised to ask if you had questions. Do you have questions? Yeah.
I have a question. As an architect, I'm really interested in the Art Place grant. And the Art Place grant is really pushing for vibrancy indicators. And I think that's really interesting in a city like LA where it's really hard to measure the outcomes of art. And I wanted to know your take on vibrancy indicators. And the Watts House project was an Art Place grant. And it fell under a lot of criticism because there was no clear, measurable outcome.
I can respond
Go.
quickly. I actually went and toured some of the NEA grants that were, some of the sites of the NEA grants in Los Angeles. And if I'm perfectly honest, and I was honest with the NEA too, I was really depressed because I thought, how in God's earth are we going to accomplish anything with opening up some sort of community center for people to paint? And so I think I really do, and it was really hard because we went there and I was excited, and it was really interesting because I live in this ivory tower and I talk about these things, and I thought this is going to be great. I'm going to go into a community with the NEA and look at what these kinds of grants can do to a community. And I walked in and I thought, you know what? This is the least of their problems, and I'm just really not sure this is a good use of money. And what I was most impressed with was the Big Brother Big Sister organization that they actually hadn't even funded yet. And so I'm not sure that they can do things with community art. I think the best thing that they can do is talent attraction and talent retention of artists and trying to get them in, but I'm not sure it's a sort of let's open up somewhere for people to do art or practice art.
My firm was a finalist for the Art Place, and the problem we were running into is they wanted us to measure health outcomes, like economic outcomes, street walkability. They had all these surveys, and we went through it, and as an architect, we're still kind of in that middle space where we're not really fitting into any grants, and at the same time, vibrancy is a really interesting way to promote sustainability in art and urbanism. But I'm really interested in its contextuality being applied to LA.
I can speak to that in the context of the Watts House project, and I think it's fascinating that we talk about this in terms of vibrancy. So the Watts House project, yes, it's very vibrant. There's like really vibrantly painted houses. It has attracted attention, but where and the criticism that you suggest is that the outcomes weren't measurable. The outcomes for the people who've been working at the Watts Towers Arts Center for the better part of their careers, like 30, 40 years, were really angry that they hadn't been talked to, that no one had spoken to them, and that the people that the artists had brought in were like using the bathroom at the Watts Towers Art Center that then they had to then go clean. And so it was this kind of like, it was literally down to the most basic infrastructural level. And so you talk about the Ivory Tower, and so even though the impulse was such a kind of wonderful one that local people in the area would have their houses painted in these spectacular ways, it was just, I remember just wandering and going like, what is going on? And then I went over to talk to the people I've known, like, you know, to my people I've been in touch with in the Watts Towers Art Center for many years, and they're like, they were so upset, like they were so angered. And it wasn't just territoriality, it was like literally that their day was being really messed up by this. And so that was a real disconnect between people who were like imagining vibrancy and measurable outcomes and actually living people on the ground. It was offensive. And that's why when this came to a big explosive meeting at LACMA, because they were behind some of the funding, I mean, people were actually in tears. It was because it was this type of level. And so it's not suddenly it comes out of the conversation of the Ivory Tower academic discourses about theories of public art or theories of like use. It's like, you know, maybe they should have had like porta potties brought in and then not pissed off the people who've been like slaving for nothing, right, for decades. I mean, it was like that level. I remember walking away going, I'm starting to really just hate this project, even though aesthetically it was appealing, and maybe some people got their, I don't know, it didn't work. And the reasons I think are very, very clear, but it was very highly politicized, and it was, and those exact reasons weren't really taken into account. So,
how do we do it? I mean, in some sense, I would disagree. And not about the NEA projects, but in some sense to help kids learn how to paint, strikes me as something that we now know as educators could change their lives, right? We know that art education at an early age can actually prepare people to be mathematicians, that it changes the way that they think, the way that they use their fine motor skills, the way that the brain begins to create all those synapses that my mom said that were supposed to snap that didn't always snap for me. And so at one level, we want that. We want that in community. Every community should have a place where you can go learn to paint or to draw at Barnsdall. And yet at the same time, it's really hard. It's really hard institutionally. It's really hard from a community development perspective. It's really hard to connect this kind of stuff together. And the NEA strikes one as maybe not the perfect organization to be doing it. Coming in at the federal level and dropping down to the local level is always a tricky thing. Yeah. And they're always going to be caught up in, we need to find an artist, right? Not necessarily a community developer or a community builder. And so how do we overcome those disconnects, I think is something.
Well, I mean, in some ways it's actually very easy. You fund it on the local level. I mean, it's actually, there's a very obvious answer for how to do it. Just like you have to put the money there. And that was very clear even before the Watts riot. This is, and the reason I keep getting back to the Watts Towers is because that was the big centerpiece of my dissertation work. And the early directors of that, who were both African American, both out of the American South, were really suspicious after the Watts riot when all this money started to come in to kind of expand the arts center, because the fear was it was going to become this art school with credentialing and all of these things that were going to give it this kind of taint of the official and the white and like the man. And what was really important was to have this be a community thing where the creative process could just be taught. It didn't really matter if the kids actually learned to paint or learned to play piano. They still have free piano lessons there. But it's like learning that there's a creative outlet beyond hanging out at the corner or doing all these things, and they made connections to Markham Junior High School. I mean, they made connections to the schools. And in the 60s, 70s, and 80s, we were still able to kind of do that. And that was a natural sort of part of like just public education. But we're at a moment right now where just the idea of public in general is a dirty word. You get accused of being a socialist if you even talk about that. There should be some sort of public programming for something.
Well, at least 47% of us are,
that's right,
together on that.
Exactly. So we're in an insane moment right now. I mean, we're just in an insane moment.
All those victims together.
But it's not. But this has been managed to be pulled off in the public school systems for generations. And it's only now that we're starting to have conversations where, oh, it's so impossible to do this. It's not. It's actually very easy to do it. You just have to do it on the local level. And then you can have those fraught conversations with the NEA person who doesn't know what they're doing, or an artist who doesn't, consult, or whose people don't consult properly. And then it creates frisson and anxieties, and then you can iron them out. But what happens, because things are fraught and the money's not there and tensions are really high, these things just, the plug gets pulled, and it's another example of another failed moment where the public sector can't do its job, and it's just really I mean, that's where the problem. It's very frustrating, and I think it's political. I mean, it's ultimately about where you're going to vote.
Do you have a quick comment before we go
Yeah,
back?
just I think to respond to both of you, David, I think you're right about the fact that it can change some people's lives. But I think then we have to ask what we want the arts to do when we come in with these grants, right? Because if the ostensible reason is to redevelop a neighborhood, then that's not the same thing as we want to create community for some kids. We want to create outlets for children who don't have a chance to do this because they don't get to go to private schools and they don't have a lot of after-school stuff to learn about the arts. So that's actually, but then you do see the success, and that leads into what Sarah's saying, which is that if we have some sort of grand idea that art's just going to literally transform a neighborhood every time, then of course we're going to walk away saying this didn't work. And I think that Sarah actually got to something really important that Jane Jacobs wrote about in Death and Life of Great American Cities, where she talks about how projects keep failing and failing and failing. And she says, well, yeah, but no one ever asked the people in the projects what they actually needed. And so then you build the same building and it falls apart again, and it's in total disarray. So I think that it's actually a very similar kind of dynamic.
It is. Other questions? Yes, sir.
You talked a little bit about ineffective public policies with regards to promoting arts. What are some effective public policies or policies that have been effective here in Los Angeles?
Yeah. What's that?
WPA.
The WPA, yes, was very effective. That's an excellent example. The public art programming that was sort of launched in the 1950s was really very visionary. This was, and I'll just talk very, very briefly about it, but Ken Ross was hired in 1947 to sort of build a public art program for the city of Los Angeles. And unlike everyone who'd ever preceded him in the arts here, who wanted to create a kind of a singular art institution that would kind of represent LA, like create the Met for LA. He's like, no, 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 this is a post-war period. The city's growing, we're sprawling, it's disconnected. Why don't we have smaller community art centers spread throughout the city, but then connect them through media, newspapers, and through buses, and be able to bus people to these things free of charge. And so he had this very, very big vision. That's what got red baited into oblivion. But I think, Percent for Art programs have been very successful here. We have the MetroLink, Metro Transit monies have circulated, and there's been some very interesting public artworks. Judy Baca's Baldwin Park. Judy Baca's Great Wall of Los Angeles, the longest mural in the world, which is still has just been beautifully renovated and still attracts audiences from all over the world to go visit. Any sort of the large-scale sort of public infusions of money and the Percent for Art programs, which most of you should know about, which insists that when you get development grants, you can build buildings, you have to have a percentage of it go into a public art space. And
one of the great examples of that is Culver City, where they used it in architectural. Yeah. If you go to the east side of Culver City into that industrial district, Eric Owens Moss's stuff, that all started out of a Percent for Art program in the city.
Long Beach has lots of them.
Long Beach as well.
has many of them, and it's really developing areas in very interesting ways. So I think there's quite a sequence of very successful art policy. It just gets overshadowed sometimes by the broader commercial art scenes, and then also by the failures.
And also the other one that people don't think of as quickly is the cultural resources. The cultural resources activities in Los Angeles are actually very early, and that most of you would know it as historic preservation, but very early and very successful. The downtown revitalization that we tied to adaptive reuse and the lack of parking actually started, at least partially, out of historic preservation, and the move by Tom Gilmore and others to take the older buildings and renovate them and maintain them. And it's one of the great successes of that downtown revitalization. They just didn't go in and whack everything, that they actually began to renovate buildings, and it actually made the downtown, in many cases, the downtown revitalization much more successful, both from an architectural, but also from an economic perspective. And so the tie between art and economics can work. It has to be viewed that way. And it's tricky now. It is trickier now to give you lots of examples than it would have been 30 years ago. It's a difficult moment for arts in the world in general, particularly among public programs. Other questions? Yes.
So at the beginning, you started talking about the sort of the magic of art and that, and now sort of we've been talking more about how it's tied to various goals of community development and helping individual kids and kind of how it's tied to these policy goals. But I'm wondering if that magic can be a policy goal in itself, and how, if you've seen programs that sort of do that, and if those might be more successful than the ones that try to do other things with art.
I mean, an example of that, and I can't, in some ways I can't believe I'm about to say this, but I am going to. And I'm going to be recorded on the record.
People are going to be able to see this.
They're going to be able to see this, and so here it is. But one of the examples, it's not a good example of policy per se, because it was an initiative, which is not the same thing, because it's not permanent. But the magic did get caught in the Pacific Standard Time shows. Like that effort, and I have criticisms of it, and I can talk in complicated ways about its history and these sorts of things, and things I would like to see differently. But as far as the individual shows, the immense curatorial skill across a large number of spaces and levels really produced an excitement in the city that I had never seen, and I don't think anyone had. And some of those shows blew me away.
Yeah, I totally agree.
The Hammer show, Now Dig This, was really spectacular. The flagship show at the Getty, I took my students who were just, for a lot of them it was their first time really at an art show ever, and they just were, they were standing in front of a Dwayne Valentine, which are these, big red, the big red see-through Jello thing, and they were just couldn't get away from the sculpture, like that kind of thing. The Light and Space show, which in San Diego, phenomenal, which I didn't get to see, but I had a grad student review it. We're just blown away. I was on a pretty good high for a lot of last year because of those shows, and that did it. I mean, it took a vast amount of money and like a decade's worth of planning to produce it, but it pulled it off. And then the books that have been published, and there was a whole sub-economy that was created because everyone were reviewing it and the people were blogging about it, and so you had this magical moment where people were rushing around all over, by the millions to see this stuff. It worked.
And it does remind one about LA. Actually, that was the striking thing about it was very much, it was about California, it was about the West, but it was in some sense about Los Angeles as a place of innovation and a place of art, which is something which goes against this, are we creative, anti-creative, reminded us that there's an enormous amount of creativity around.
And it's also, I think it's the thing that really is highlighted in the Pacific Standard Time exhibit is the democracy of it. So I think that one of the problems with a lot of art is that it is elitist, and I think that is really off-putting. I mean, one of the questions Sarah and I did an interview with KCET as a part of today's talk, and they asked us about this, or one of the questions I was asked was sort of this tension between the high art and low art, and I just think it's like not ever a bad thing if more people go to museums.
No,
and
never.
I have a PhD in urban planning, and I'm so excited that the Atlantic Monthly has a cities blog, because you know what? More people care about cities, and that's a really important thing to me. And so I know that there are, for artists, it's a very different story, and I've talked to some of my artist friends in Los Angeles about the mocha stuff and the art in the streets, and I understand that there are many different perspectives. But in a general sense, more awareness is better than less, and I think that creates the magic, and I think that's what Pacific Standard Time did. Now, the thing I will say, Sarah, because you're now writing your dissertation, when I was doing my dissertation, I went to the Whitman Museum and I saw Ryan McGinley's The Kids Are All Right. So Ryan McGinley's an artist who does a lot of kind of rough looks at inside subcultures. And I saw The Kids Are All Right, and it was a whole montage of photographs of young skateboarders in New York. There were some homosexual overtones, undertones, and I was amazed. It was the most amazing thing I had ever seen. I thought it was so cool and magical, and I was like, I'm going to do my dissertation. I knew I was going to do it on cities, but it was photos of kids in cities, and it was art. And I went to Susan Feinstein, who was my advisor, and I said, Susan, I want to do this. And she said, well, you need numbers, because you know what? Everyone's going to say, so what? So what? Why should we care? So I think that on a federal level, that's why all the numbers and the economics matter so much, is because I guess that's how you get the dollars. But as Sarah said, the magic happens on the local level. It really does.
Last question. Yeah.
I wondered if you can comment on the current City of Los Angeles situation with the murals.
Can you be a little more specific what you're thinking of?
Well, I'm very interested in the history you gave, for example, 1951 and the abstract expressionism, and I see a parallel in a way with called writers, graffiti artists, and artists who use fonts and letters, and they're prohibited from practicing their art or creating art because it falls under this rubric of billboards and advertisement. And where do you think, how do you think the city or people can negotiate this? Because it seems to be a very popular art form, and billboards in Los Angeles, of course, are ubiquitous. So what does this mean for our economy as artists, as consumers of culture, and also as people who live in the city and help make decisions?
Oh, you've asked a really good question. And the specifics of these sets of ordinances that are actually quite recent, I can't speak to, I don't know enough about it. But the history of kind of muralism in Los Angeles is incredibly rich. I mean, we were the place where David Siqueiros chose to come in 1932 to produce Tropical America. He could have gone anywhere. It was here he wanted to do it in Los Angeles because he wanted to be tied to Hollywood. He wanted their projections. He wanted to use their materials. And he also wanted to hang out with movie stars. I mean, why not? And of course, that mural was covered up and is about to be unveiled in a couple of weeks, finally in 80 years. Subsequent to that history, we've had a lot of muralism produced in the 30s, 40s. To this day, LA is one of the most highly muraled cities in the country. The city of LA, as a policy producer, has had problems with it in different ways than, say, Philadelphia, which also has amazing murals, but they actually have a public art program for it. In part, it's because Los Angeles tried to co-opt it. One of the things that happened in the 1980s with the '84 Olympics was the Riley administration decided that they would then sort of take what was essentially renegade mural production and make it something that would be sort of state sanctioned. So that's when you get the DARE murals and the Olympic murals and all that stuff that really covered the 110, the 101 freeways for the better part of the 80s, 90s, and until about 10 years ago. And then the graffiti artists reacted really vehemently to it because how dare you take our walls that we've been working on, that we have to struggle to get to and like hop off our cars, and suddenly it's acceptable and it's the city that's paying for them, and they started tagging them mercilessly, but always in a way that shows just enough of the mural below it to like remind you that like what they're actually doing. Even if there's space over here to paint, they're going to paint on the state-sanctioned murals. Meanwhile, the Estrada Court murals, right, on the east side of LA, on the other side of the river, those don't get tagged that way. There's a certain reverence about that, and there's a reverence about the Judy Baca murals, and the people are very respectful. So there's a whole conversation that's going on amidst all the kids who are tagging and the kids who are actually serious graffiti artists in dialogue with the city of Los Angeles over these very issues. And like the LA Police Department has tried to do things like have special spaces where you can put up your own graffiti, and that's going to be okay, and even teach kids like how to do it. But who wants to do that? That's so incredibly uncool. Like, the whole point of it is that you're like doing it illegally. So long story short, I can't speak to the very specific question, but like this conversation between like the sanctioned mural and the unsanctioned mural should, in my mind, always be ongoing, and it should always be this fraught thing. That's the point of it. Yeah. And so it means that some beautiful murals sometimes get damaged, but then we can fix them again. And that the fact that haunting this whole story has been 80 years of the Siqueiros mural sort of shimmering behind its whitewash, waiting for the moment to pop out is such a great metaphor.
So I can speak a little bit to the changes, though. If you look up Tanner Blackman, who's one of our alums, he led a movement to, what really happened to the murals is that the billboard companies sued and said that if you're going to allow murals under your laws, then we should be able to do billboards anywhere. Mm-hmm. That there was no way that you can sanction, you can separate the two. That it's all free speech, and as long as the city's going to have a ordinance that allows murals, it has to allow billboards to be anywhere. That commercial speech is not separate from artistic speech, and there was a huge fight. And the city essentially said, no, we're not going to do anything. because they lost in court on the First Amendment right. They have in the last year crafted a mural ordinance that I believe was passed in the spring and is now separated murals from the free speech issues around the billboards. And so I think the issue has shifted pretty dramatically in the last 6 months. But prior to that, the city was essentially paralyzed by its own inability to think about how to do anything about this, that it had come to a complete stop. And at that point, they began to stop all mural activity, sanctioned or unsanctioned. And now, as I understand it, that has now begun to shift. And it's now opened up, and people are going to be able to get back to paint murals through the activities of one of our alums. We're very proud of him. Last question. It's a short one.
Actually, I was turned on to the same subject, and I was doing research, and I found that there's a second final draft for the mural ordinance, and if you want, I can send it if people want to sign the petition, because I guess it wasn't passed. So.
That's funny. I thought it was, but I believe you. You're sitting there looking at your magic machine, so I'm going to trust you. All right. Thank our guests.